But there was one 24-year-old Ukrainian woman named Lyudmila Pavlichenko, and she wasn't about to let Nazi Germany take over her beloved USSR.
They mocked her, called her a joke, and thought a woman with a rifle could never be a threat. But on the battlefields of World War II, the Germans learned a cruel lesson. She was young, determined, and deadly accurate. Every shot she fired carried both vengeance and skill, and soon whispers of her name spread across the front lines.
World War II woman warrior. And she was a sniper, known as Lady Death. By the way,
they called her Lady Death. What began as laughter turned to fear, and her story became one of the most shocking in military history. Who was she, and how did she change the war forever? Roots of a sharpshooter. Long before the Germans learned to whisper her name in fear, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was just a girl who hated being underestimated. She was born in 1916 in Bila Tserkva, Ukraine, during a time when her country was still part of the Russian Empire, 1 year before the Bolshevik Revolution. Her father had fought in the Red Army during the Russian Civil War, and her mother worked as a teacher. The family often moved following her father's career, which meant Lyudmila was forced to start over in new schools year after year. It toughened her, and it gave her a fierce independence. Neighbors remembered her as a tomboy, more interested in racing boys in the streets and climbing trees than in sitting indoors. She loved sports, running, and competition. She wasn't about to be boxed in by tradition, and she made a point of proving she could match or even outdo the boys around her. That stubborn streak would later serve her on the battlefield, but it started with something far less dramatic: bragging contests between teenagers. When the Pavlichenko family finally settled in Kiev, she was 14 and once again struggling to fit into a new community. A neighborhood boy, full of pride, often bragged about his shooting skills. Lyudmila grew tired of hearing it and, determined to humble him, signed up for a local shooting club. What might have been a teenage dare turned into a discovery. She wasn't just good with a rifle, she was exceptional. Her steady hand, keen eyesight, and relentless practice soon earned her medals in marksmanship competitions. One story from these early years shows just how natural her talent was. At a carnival, a shooting booth challenged customers with 12 small targets. Hit one, and you won a prize. Lyudmila bought 15 bullets. One by one, she dropped every single target without missing. The man running the booth went pale as he realized he would have to hand her a dozen prizes. Embarrassed, she gave them back. To her, it wasn't about trinkets. It was about proving a point. But though her years as a teenager brought Lyudmila closer to weapons in much more serious terms, it was not an opportunity to take part in perhaps the most exciting job in the world. She was employed at the Kyiv Arsenal factory, learning firearms mechanics inside and out. Not a simple factory line, but rather a crash course on the engineering and maintenance of the very rifles that would later define her career. Every bolt, every barrel, every flaw became familiar to her hands. The factory floor became her second classroom, and it gave her a technical edge that few soldiers, let alone snipers, could claim. Every bolt, every barrel, every flaw, they all became known to her hands. At 16, Lyudmila married a young Alexei Pavlichenko and, soon after, gave birth to her son, Rostislav. She divorced Alexei, but kept the surname, as marriage and motherhood came early in the Soviet Union, as most women would perform both family and work functions. That marriage was supposed to earn its glory for Lyudmila, but it was short-lived. She had made her way to Kyiv University by the end of the 1930s era. Student, history, work, and motherhood, unrelenting pressure combinations. It could make it sound like the destiny of a scholar instead of a soldier. However, History was closing upon her. June 1941 strangled her dreams of teaching as she saw Hitler's Operation Barbarossa thunder into the Soviet Union with the German machine. The bombs fell onto Kiev, and the school Lyudmila attended was razed. Just like that, the student became a soldier in waiting. The most feared female sniper in the world did not spring from the field. She had her origins in dogged pride, carnival games, factory halls, and lecture rooms. She had sharpened her aim long before she ever looked down a scope at a Nazi. What she lacked was a war to prove it, and soon that war would deliver her trial by fire. Baptism by fire. When the German invasion tore across the Soviet Union in June 1941, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was not the kind of recruit military officers expected. She was 24, a history student at Kiev University with a young son and plans to become a teacher. Yet when Operation Barbarossa rolled toward Ukraine, the lecture halls turned into rubble, and the time for books ended. Lyudmila walked to the enlistment office, not with a dream of patching wounds, but with medals that proved she could hit targets as well as any man. The recruiters scoffed. Women, they said, were needed as nurses. Lyudmila refused. She had not spent years learning the Mosin Nagant rifle just to carry bandages. The officer chuckled, but his grin faded when she scattered her marksmanship trophies across his desk. Reluctantly, they gave her a uniform. Still, skepticism followed her like a shadow. Her first days at the front were a cruel introduction. The Red Army was collapsing under the Nazi onslaught, and rifles were scarce. Lyudmila found herself digging trenches, clutching only a single grenade, while battles raged around her. She later admitted the frustration. It was hard to watch the battle with only one grenade in my hand. She had come to fight, but instead sat helpless, waiting for a chance that might never come. That chance arrived with fire and steel. An artillery blast ripped through her unit, shredding earth and bone. The soldier beside her collapsed, his rifle slipping into the dirt. Without hesitation, Lyudmila grabbed it. The weight of the weapon in her hands felt like destiny. For the first time, she could do more than dig. She could strike back. Her superiors decided promptly to put her to the test. The test was merciless. Slay 2 enemy soldiers standing in the open. The intent was more to break recruits than to validate them. One shot would alert the second. He would dive for cover or fire back. Many experienced men had failed such a task in the past. Lyudmila showed no hesitation. She calmed her breath, compensated for the wind, and fired. One fell. Before the other could react, she fired again. 2 slays, 2 headshots. The way was set for her to operate as a sniper. The mission became her baptism by fire. From then on, she was no longer a student and mother. She had become a sniper in the Red Army. It wasn't a matter of numbers. It was a matter of belonging. Before long, in the eyes of her comrades, the woman who had come with medals had earned her blood-drenched stripes. Such lessons would never have been taught to her in the classroom. War was above bravery. It was about endurance. She learned how to calm her racing heart under fire, how to fight off panic when bullets whizzed nearby. She learned how to move with silent stealth, how to merge with earth and shadow, and how often sheer patience was the deciding factor when it came to living or dying. With this, Lyudmila's initiation became a vast baptism of fear. Encamped in a tree one time, Lyudmila was spotted by German soldiers. Bullets splintered the branches around her. She plunged from the tree and lay still, pretending to be dead, while the battle raged all around her. Hours went by, and while her comrades fell, she did not budge. It was only when night fell that she crawled back, smeared with dirt and blood. Her fellow soldiers stared at her as though she were a ghost. From that point onward, Whispers circulated of a woman who played with death. This baptism made her name. No longer could she be dismissed as a girl with medals. She was a soldier, a sniper, and soon a legend. The Germans would curse the day that brought her into the world. But first, she had to prove that those two sleighs were not luck. Ahead lay Odessa, Sevastopol, and the birth of Lady Death. Lady Death emerges. By autumn 1941, the German advance swept south toward Odessa, a port city whose defense would mark one of the Soviet Union's fiercest early struggles. Among the troops of the 25th Rifle Division was Lyudmila Pavlichenko, rifle in hand, her baptism behind her. Odessa would be where her skill sharpened and her legend began to spread. From hidden nests among rubble and trees, she hunted with methodical calm. German and Romanian soldiers advancing on Soviet lines dropped under her scope one by one. She recorded each sleigh with precision. By the time Odessa fell, her tally stood at 187 confirmed sleighs. To her comrades, she was no longer simply Pavlichenko. She was becoming something larger. Her methods set her apart. Lyudmila had the patience of stone. She would lie in the same position for hours, refusing to twitch, even as insects bit or mud chilled her bones. She devised tricks to lure enemies into the open, placing scarves or helmets as decoys, shifting nests to keep opponents guessing, and even letting rumors of her position spread to sow fear. The Germans grew wary, slowing their advances, watching every shadow. In the chaos of Odessa, her presence made the enemy hesitate, and hesitation in war could mean defeat. The Germans knew her name. Loudspeakers blared insults and offers of chocolate if she defected. They promised to carve her into 309 pieces, mocking her growing sleigh count. Far from scaring her, their threats only fueled her resolve. "Every time my bullet found its target," she later said, "I felt as if I had saved lives." Her transfer to Sevastopol brought even harsher tests. The Black Sea fortress endured months of bombardment, its defenders holding against overwhelming odds. Here, Lyudmila's role expanded beyond simple sniping. She was tasked as a counter-sniper, hunting the hunters sent specifically to slay her. Rarely did the duels involve actual fire. She could lie still for 15-20 hours.
She would have to stay in her hiding spot without moving for as long as it took to take down the other snipers. On average, it would take her 15 to 20 hours to spot and kill the enemy sniper.
Locked in silence, her adversary invisible. The Germans resorted to all sorts of tricks: a helmet on a stick, a reflective trash can, and even throwing in a live cat. But not Lyudmila. She simply would not take the bait. She would wait for the enemy to fumble, and that was when she would strike. 36 enemy snipers met their fate among the rapidly rising stars from her rifle. Marksmen all, and their duels with her were always treacherous games of chess played in mud and blood. Her fame soared. Soldiers spoke in whispers about the woman who never missed. To fight next to her was reassurance. To meet her in combat was horror itself. By the time the Germans took Sevastopol in the summer of 1942, her count had gone beyond 300. By now, she was more than just a sniper. She was Lady Death, a living symbol of Soviet defiance. But her ascendancy did have scars. She witnessed the razing of villages. She saw their residents mutilated, the old shot down, standing. Hatred did not come to us all at once, she was to say, but we learned it after we saw what they could do. That hatred was her strongest motivation, but no medal could erase those wounds. She was a great shooter, and more. When officers fell, she took charge. Once during an operation when men hesitated, a comrade yelled, "Cowards! Look at this woman! She has more courage than us all." They then followed her orders, and she brought them back alive. By the time she left Sevastopol, Lady Death was more than a name. She was a legend, whispered in Germany's trenches, a rallying point for the Soviet troops, and a testament that one determined woman could change the fear balance in a fight of giants. As bribes turn to threats and her count soars past 300, the duels that define her legend sharpen not just her aim, but her mind. The counter-sniper mind. If slaying infantry was the bread and butter of Lyudmila Pavlichenko's war, counter-sniping was the razor's edge that defined her mastery. Few tasks on the battlefield demanded as much patience, nerve, and psychological control as a sniper duel. It was not simply a contest of skill. It was a battle of minds, where one flicker of movement or moment of weakness meant death. By the time she reached Sevastopol, Pavlichenko was already a veteran of countless hunts. But here, she was assigned to eliminate German snipers who had begun terrorizing Soviet positions. It was a job only the most disciplined shooters could attempt. Most duels were slow, grueling affairs. Hours stretched into entire days. Soldiers fought battles in minutes. Snipers fought wars in silence. Her approach was methodical. First, she studied the terrain, mapping every bush, ridge, and hollow where an enemy might hide. Then she waited. Often lying prone in sweltering heat or bone-chilling cold, she endured insect bites, thirst, and the ache of remaining absolutely motionless. Every shift of muscle risked giving away her position. To stay still, she learned to control her breathing, slowing her heart rate until she felt like part of the earth itself. The Germans used tricks to flush her out. They dangled helmets on sticks, tossed shiny tins into the sun, and even released cats or dogs into open ground to test her restraint. Lesser snipers might have taken the bait. Lyudmila never did. She knew that the real enemy was watching, waiting for her to flinch. When they thought her patience had broken, she struck. Some duels became tests of endurance beyond human limits. In her memoirs, she recalled one that lasted 3 full days. Without food or water, her lips cracked and her muscles screamed, but she refused to break. When the German finally shifted, confident she had left, she ended it with a single shot. Encounters like this earned her 36 sniper versus sniper victories, a number virtually unheard of in military history. It was not mere accuracy that made her lethal. It was psychology. For Pavlichenko, the enemy's mind was as clear as his locations. She sensed desperation and arrogance, fatigue too. A sniper's duel, she said, is like a chess game where the loser doesn't get another match. With every slay, her reputation grew, until, soon enough, much German chatter revealed how greatly feared she had become. Entire sections warned others when Lady Death was suspected to be nearby. It was indeed a mental burden. Hours on end looking through a scope could warp vision and dull reflexes. Watching comrades die while waiting for her shot required nerves of steel. Still, somewhere within, she found strange tranquility in the job. Detachment was needed for sniping, viewing the enemy not as people, but as targets. A hatred, she later revealed, became the fuel. We are a peace-loving people, but after seeing what they have done, hatred rose within us. Too much fear to make us fear them. Her success was paid for with suffering. Stillness fused her body into a stiff mass, marked and scarred. Shrapnel wounds were an increase to her woes upon returning to the battlefield again and again. Yet the duels were something the others did not have. They gave her control within the chaos. Where artillery would rain without specification, and the infantry fought without aim, Pavlichenko dictated her timing. 1 bullet, 1 life, 1 less opponent to her comrades. The very existence of Pavlichenko on the front lines and in history is a story so unique that the very duels and one-on-one warfare could justify it. To outshoot, outweight, and outthink dozens of Germany's best marksmen was not merely her victory, but was the glorious validation that wars are won not merely by brute strength, but with patience, wit, and iron resolve. Lyudmila Pavlichenko was not merely a sniper. She epitomized the counter-sniper philosophy, a hunter who turned the enemy's own instrument against them and reminded the world that discipline can be deadlier than any gun. After 3-day standoffs and nerves honed to a razor, her deadliest weapon isn't the Mosin Nagant. It's the poise she'll soon wield on a global stage. A weapon called story, the U.S. tour. By 1942, Lyudmila Pavlichenko was no longer just a soldier. She was a symbol. With 309 confirmed slays and the fearsome nickname Lady Death.
With every passing moment, Pavlichenko was finding more and more motivation to keep on killing Nazis. Eventually, her kill counter was raised to a total of 309, not counting the first 2 men that she'd killed.
She had already become a legend across the Soviet Union. But to Joseph Stalin and his generals, her greatest value was no longer behind a scope. It was behind a podium. The war was going badly for the Soviets. German forces had pushed deep into Soviet territory, and though Red Army soldiers fought ferociously, the cost was staggering. Stalin knew the USSR could not win alone. He needed help from the Allies, particularly the United States, which had entered the war after Pearl Harbor, but had not yet opened a European front. Pavlichenko, young, heroic, and female, was the perfect ambassador. So, in late 1942, Lady Death traded her Mosin Nagant rifle for a new weapon, words. She traveled first to Canada and then to the United States, where she was met with curiosity, fanfare, and, at first, condescension. American reporters, dazzled by the novelty of a woman sniper, peppered her with questions about fashion and femininity. They asked why she didn't wear makeup, how she felt about her uniform making her look boxy, and whether she could still find romance in wartime. One journalist even suggested she ought to powder her nose before entering battle. Lyudmila, hardened by years of slaying Nazis, did not flinch. She answered with dry wit that disarmed her critics more effectively than any bullet. "I wear my uniform with honor," she told them. "It has no unnecessary trimmings. It suits me." The moment Pavlichenko spoke to the crowds directly, audience perception shifted. With a translator beside her, she described the horrific events of the Eastern Front. Villages were burned, children were slain, and women were violated. She did not speak like a politician, but instead as a survivor. And this harshness sat deep with audiences. "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old, and I have ended 309 fascist invaders. Don't you think you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" she said in Chicago, standing before thousands and in one line, reverberating throughout America. The crowd erupted in applause. For the first time, Americans confronted the war not as a distant conflict, but as a shared responsibility. If a young woman from Ukraine could face down Hitler's soldiers, what excuse did American men have? Her best support during the tour was the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor took Lyudmila under her wing because she, too, was indignant over the sorts of sexist questions that so many reporters hurled at her. She offered her advice on public speaking and critic ignoring, traveled with her through 43 states in the United States, and did all that she could to facilitate and foster their relationship, which went beyond mere politics. In photographs from the trip, Pavlichenko's rare smile usually appeared next to Eleanor. It was a good trip for Washington. It would further increase public sentiment in favor of aiding the Soviet Union. Pavlichenko's presence made such a corporation also human. It would be a strange interlude for Lyudmila. This event had her being produced at banquets, posing for photos, and receiving adoration like a celebrity, while the reality of Sevastopol and Odessa loomed heavily in her mind. She lent ghosts of comrades lost, and at times, just the sparkle of American life made her sorrow deeper. Yet, she accomplished her mission. She had proven that stories could be more effective than bullets. Through sharing her own, she gathered allies, silenced doubtful tongues, and showed the world that courage could never be segregated to either gender. From Chicago podiums to Eleanor Roosevelt's side, her words rally allies, but the cheers can't drown out what follows soldiers home. Cost after victory. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Lyudmila Pavlichenko returned home not as the quiet student she had once been, but as a national icon. She had survived battles that swallowed entire divisions, stared down enemy snipers in duels lasting days, and carried the title of Lady Death with a mix of pride and exhaustion. But victory brought her no peace. The Soviet Union celebrated her with medals, parades, and postage stamps. She was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor, and her name was etched into history books. Yet behind the official glory lived a woman scarred by memories she could not erase. Pavlichenko was only 29 years old when the war ended, but she carried a lifetime of violence within her. She finished her master's degree in history at Kyiv University and began working as a historian for the Soviet Navy. To the outside world, it looked like a dignified career for a decorated veteran. But the transition from battlefields to lecture halls was not smooth. Nightmares followed her home. She had seen comrades shredded by artillery, civilians massacred in villages, and her lover, fellow sniper Leonid Kitsenko, die in her arms. These images refused to fade. Alcohol became her companion. Like many veterans haunted by what we now call PTSD, Pavlichenko tried to drown her memories at the bottom of a bottle. Colleagues remembered her as brilliant, but troubled. A woman who sometimes disappeared into drinking binges and long bouts of depression. The Soviets rarely spoke of trauma. Soldiers were expected to be heroes, not broken survivors, and there was little sympathy for those who struggled in silence. Even her fame cast a shadow on her soul. The very sword that became a weapon for her among men at war became a cage afterward. Lady Death could not be anything but Lyudmila, the mother or a friend. Every public appearance needed the same rigid heroine, while inside there was a civil strife of grief and loss. Another quiet wound, she casually looked for a son, and that was a son, Rostislav, whom relatives practically brought up in the war and grew far away from her. Even those rays of hope landed, a lot of them, from a string she had tied so far away from the front line. In 1957, Eleanor Roosevelt came to Moscow with a goodwill mission. The former First Lady insisted on getting in touch with her old friend from the wartime tour, even though Cold War tensions were piling up. Initially, the Soviets shook their heads and were quite taken with the possibility of such contact without supervision. However, Roosevelt did not take no for an answer. Even though the two women met last, they both embraced each other privately, while minders and Secret Service agents kicked the door hard. The event, for Pavlichenko, who had spent better than half of her years mired in shadows and propaganda, affirmed to her that a real friendship could survive outside borders and beyond ideologies. Yet, the piercing years started giving way to desolation. By the time it was the 1960s, she hardly appeared in public. Younger generations of Soviets saw her mostly as someone out of the textbooks. but hardly as a living person. The human body bore wounds of shrapnel and age, but memory bore heavier burdens. On October 10, 1974, she passed on in Moscow at the tender age of 58 years. Her tale tells of another paradox: triumph, but tragedy; unshakable courage, but unhealed scars. She had slain 300 enemy soldiers, fought different duels with the best snipers of Germany, and had countries come out on their feet for victory. Medals gleam while ghosts gather, and survival demands a different courage, the strength to live with what the war left behind. Beyond the myth. History often remembers Lyudmila Pavlichenko as a number: 309 confirmed slays, a record, a statistic, a grim scoreboard of death. But to see her only as Lady Death is to flatten the life of a woman who was much more than a sniper. Beyond the battlefield, Pavlichenko became a symbol of courage, of resilience, and of what it meant to fight not just enemies abroad, but expectations at home. The myth of Lady Death was crafted during the war. Soviet propaganda elevated her into a near legendary figure, the female warrior who made Nazi officers tremble. Her story was told in newspapers, posters, and radio broadcasts as proof that Soviet women could stand shoulder to shoulder with men in defense of the motherland. To her comrades, she was both an inspiration and a reminder that survival meant adapting to roles once thought impossible. But the myth left little room for vulnerability. Behind the rifle was a woman who felt loss deeply, who longed for her studies, who had been a young mother before she became a soldier. The Western world, too, shaped its own myth around her. In America, her wartime tour turned her into an oddity in the press, a female slayer who drew both fascination and skepticism. Reporters reduced her to questions about lipstick and uniforms, missing the depth of her experiences. Yet when she spoke, especially alongside Eleanor Roosevelt, she challenged stereotypes head-on. It contradicted every assumption that women were too gentle for war. Her words carried a sharpness that was both defiant and edged with humor. At just 25, with hundreds of confirmed slays to her name, she stood as living proof that courage was not bound by gender. Lady Death was not a fragile figure, but a voice carved from stone, one that cut cleanly through doubt and dismissal. What makes Pavlichenko's legacy survive is the contradiction in her successes, the fact that she was both a student and then a soldier, a mother and then a fighter, that people would praise and condemn all at once. Her slays were all real, but she was often stripped of her humanity. People telling her story tend to focus solely on the deadly precision of her rifle. Equally important to this is that during the silence after the rifle, she showed quiet determination as she continued her education, became a historian, and kept the invisible wounds of war long after the medals were pinned on her chest. Pavlichenko today evokes the memory of how war changes those who partake in it, but this change does not erase the fact that they are complex. The cultural icon of Ukraine and Russia-based films, novels, and songs for many women. Her narrative complicates the story of women in wars, not as nurses or aides, but as fighters in the extreme, whose skills could turn the tide against an army. And yet, perhaps her greatest legacy is the friendship she formed with Eleanor Roosevelt, which stood outside the usual political sphere. In those rare photographs where Pavlichenko is seen smiling, Lady Roosevelt is often by her side, a cue that even Lady Death yearned for moments of bonding, laughter, and acknowledgement beyond the precincts of a rifle. If this story challenged what you thought a sniper could be, like the video, drop a comment on the moment that stunned you most, and subscribe for more untold history. When you're ready for another deep dive, watch the next video on your screen. there's one more legend waiting in the shadows.